Hey guys, I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. Okay, so I'm going to talk real quickly about 5 things that TSR or the original Dungeons and Dragons got wrong. Um, you could assign a lot of blame to people. I'm just going to keep this as a general statement. I think a lot of this will be explanatory as I go why. So I'm not going to say it here. This video also could have been titled that 5 things TSR left out of original Dungeons and Dragons, but I kind of like this wording better because it hits the mark, I think, a little bit closer to the point. For sure, there are 5 things that they left out of the game that they could have put into the game, and that might be a future video. I'll talk more about how that could happen near the end of the video, though. I'm also not going to go for the low-hanging fruit. I think everyone who has looked into original Dungeons and Dragons a lot knows that they could have hired an editor sooner and that the game would have been a lot better because of it. They did basically hire Tim Cass immediately, so I'm not going to fault that because from what I understand, it was within a gnat's hair, shall we say, of not being released because of financial constraints and all that. And as we now know in retrospect, unfortunately, Mr. Don Kay passed away as this was being released, whether it was technically before or after. So if he was not there for his support, I think this would have been a failed system. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the first one. This is poison. The rules could have had more complexity. The game came from a binary system. Chainmail is the origin of this game in many ways, I should say, really. And that was a binary game. If you are hit, you are dead. So if you're not hit, you survive. This game realized while doing playtesting that wasn't necessarily the best system. That people enjoyed having more hit points, being able to take a hit or two, being able to earn that through levels and gameplay. That the 6th level Myrmidon fighter for a dwarf was way better at being in combat than the halfling thief, or the halfling fighter, because they're rolling a D4 versus a D8, and that was the big thing about that people enjoyed, was having differences between each class, not just this mass combat thing. Well, that's where poison misses. Let me go ahead and clarify this some. So poison, like damage in chainmail, was binary. It was hit equals death. Death equals a hit dice. Really, higher levels was that. But in poison, it just was dead. You didn't take into account at all hit dice. Poison was the one type of damage that made it from chainmail that had its own specific rules in original Dungeons and Dragons. This meant it was specific to leveling, which meant that poison didn't care what level you were. It just killed you. When this game came out, people didn't like how the hit equals death, and they wanted to have the hit points. They wanted to have the differences between levels, and they wanted to have D8s and D4s and this type of stuff. There was none of that for poison. Now, this might have explained and maybe educated in some way about what HP comes from and why hit points are a thing, because literally hit equals death, and then it became points later, and then it became a dichotomy of points, I guess you could say, a difference of points between each of the classes because they rolled different types of dice. And that might be helpful, but where poison is, none of that exists. Essentially, this is where they went wrong. When poison hits, it doesn't care what level you are, it doesn't care if you have more hit points or not, it just kills you. In later editions of the game, they have poison do damage to your stats, which I think is interesting. They also have poison do damage to the person, and I feel like that is also interesting. What that allows you to do, though, is allows you to have a difference between a giant wasp that can kill you in a single attack, a spider bite from like Shelob or something like that that would kill you in a single attack, and like poison oak, a plant that is fairly irritating when you brush into it, or a toxic swamp that's filled with like a gas or an air that burns the lungs and causes you other complications, which are awesome for telling a story and for bringing you into the world and why people avoid the swamp and don't go into this group of trees and whatever. It also means that a pit viper doesn't have a near miss. They have deaths, and then they have those that have never met a pit viper or never been bit by one. There is no one in the bar with a scar that's, look at this nasty thing. This was from a pit viper. I fell into a trap and I only went knee deep, but inside there was a warren of vipers, and one latched onto my leg and caused me this great damage, and now I limp because, of this. My adventuring days are done. There's no one like that. They're just dead. You know what I'm saying? And that's not what the game was intending. There's a realism in this game that is lost when you make it so simple and black and white. Many things in this game, how combat existed, how you could parry, how you could do all these things in man-to-man, and that was considered to be a superior system than the alternative combat system, are gone when you take away like permanent scars, a system I use. If you watch the video on that's called How I Do Combat, you can see how I make veterans that are covered with scars where they came close to death, and they can look at some whelp and be like, hey, your skin is too free and clean. You need to go home, back to your mama before you die. Things like that. The elements of the game that brings are gone. All right, so the second point, hobbits and halflings. Hobbits were in the rule books initially. They were changed to halfling because the Tolkien estate, or the people who had authority over it, some guy in LA, for example, came in and said, no, and you can't do this, and you're going to owe us money and all this type of stuff. I'll get more into that later, and probably in their own videos in the future. But this also was a thing with Gygax. Gygax has several interviews where he talks about the fact that he's not okay, essentially, with the number of hobbits at his table. That he wanted something a little bit less than the Fellowship of the Ring at every game table he went to, with every Legolas and Aragorn, being kind of like an eye roll. And he didn't really know how to avoid the mass, I almost want to say hysteria of these books that came out during this period of time. It was a very influential part of the world in the game genre at that time. And I think the halflings kind of took it in the shorts, if you know what I'm saying with this. I would say, to be honest, this was more of a TSR in general thing that wanted more of a human-centric. And why I say human-centric, why I say TSR in general, not just Gygax, is Tim Cass, Dave Arneson, Dave Wesley, all the people that I've considered to be sort of founders of the role-play games, all preferred to run a human-centric type of world. They had elves, dwarves, and halflings around, but they weren't the majority. And there may be communities of them where they were, but they were hidden and secluded and maybe away from the normal, and were considered to be, different. Not in a bad different, but like they're not the ruling class outside of their maybe kingdom, where it's known to be a dwarven kingdom, and halflings have to check their ego when they go there, if not more than just their ego. They might have to check their weapons. And I think that brings a lot of interest to the game too. And I think that's kind of where they missed it. But let's go ahead and talk more about the problem that is halfling in like the mechanics of the rules. So you have I've used the word dichotomy once already, and I'll go ahead and break down that word a little bit more. You have two things that are the same, but they're very different depending on the perspective or the situation you're looking at. So, halflings were capped at level 4. They didn't have any other class other than fighter to be, and they didn't have any sort of improved vision, even though they're a demi-human. So they don't get the benefit of being a human, as in they get to fit in most societies. So they're a little bit of an outsider in the first place. They don't get the benefit of better vision, and they still suffer all the level cap restrictions and stuff like that. And they were the worst. They were level 4, where at least the fighter was, or the dwarf was a level 6. Now, like dwarves, they get to share the benefit of having the improved resistance to magic, and that's a big thing, not anything small. But, I'm going to talk more about the good things that halflings had in the halfling video. Their ability to be out in the wilderness and this type of stuff, and how they fit in those type of situations, and their improved resistances to spells and these type of things. So I have a video called To Be a Halfling. Well, that's the thumbnail at least. You can look it up in my channel, or you can just do a search for Original Dungeons and Dragons and then put halfling, you'll find it. And in that video, I go way more in depth talking about all the positive negatives and giving you more perspective of why this race maybe had more problems in Original Dungeons and Dragons than some of the other ones. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into number 3. Number 3, fall damage and drowning. This is another one of those I kind of put together because it's not really like poison. There is drama that comes from it when you are drowning or when you're falling. This is a pretty big moment in your character's life. You'll either survive it or you won't generally. However, how you survive it, I think, is way more interesting, or how badly you don't survive it, I think, is way more interesting than just saying, "Nope, you're dead." You know what I'm saying? And they kind of had that binary hit system still in there from the chainmail. You can see how this kind of relates later in other editions, when you even go into like AD&D First Edition, which came out 3 years after this, or you look into Holmes, which was a revisement of Original Dungeons & Dragons, or you look into BX, Basic Expert, which came out, was that like 7 years later? They had similar fall damage and drowning systems, but they had made some evolution in it. And I feel like they could have done that in this one too. I don't think they needed a whole different thing, but I think there was room in there for more than what they had. The problem is these rules come from chainmail. They revert you back to chainmail, where it says X happens and then you take a hit and you essentially die. You translate that back into Original Dungeons and Dragons, so now you're having to do like, what is the word? Okay, go back over here and use the word. What does that mean over here? It's like you're translating from 2 different scrolls into a language you know. And that's a problem. And in that, you say, okay, so he takes a hit. He takes another hit because he fell another 10 feet. So that's 2d6 worth of damage, because a hit equals a d6 of damage. But it doesn't take into consideration any of the things. Like if you have thieves, it doesn't take into the fact that thieves have climb sheer wall and they're not wearing plate mail and the fighter is. Therefore, the thief should have more survivability in swimming and in falling because they're not wearing plate mail. It doesn't take into encumbrance and that type of stuff more than it just affects the movement speed. But if you're wearing plate mail or have 300 pounds attached to your back, 300 coins attached to your back, that should affect your movement, not just in speed going up and down, but your ability to have the strength to climb, your ability to have the strength to keep swimming, or not just sink, because 300 pounds is enough to pull you to the bottom of the ocean. And I think those things are not in the game. There's not even the suggestion of this thing, except outside of maybe the encumbrance rules. Many people didn't even play with the encumbrance rules. What's crazy about this to me is it's not like the writers of Original Dungeons and Dragons were against giving suggestions inside the rules. They gave many suggestions in the rules talking about how you could do something better, how you could do this thing, how this thing was better than that thing. And I think those are systems that were basically missed that could have been better. So I'm going to go ahead and yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I think you understand. It's not necessarily how fast you swim and how many feet you move while you're swimming that matters. It's the fact that you have 300 coins of weight on you in plate mail. That's the issue. And you'd probably sink. And that's not in the rules at all. And I think that's where they kind of went wrong. Another one is they kind of kept going back. So we're into the fourth one here. They kind of kept going back into using other people's rules. So you see this in Chainmail, which is great because of the system that TSR owns. Also in the Sky game and in the ship game, don't give up the ship. You see these in these rules in there where they come up with like AC and combat and this type of stuff. That's fine. TSR owns those companies and they're trying to sell their other products. I get it. They try to branch out into Avalon Hill space with outdoor survival. That's not their system. Avalon Hill probably didn't necessarily want them associating their game with their game. And they certainly didn't want how Gygax handled it moving forward into their game. That's their thing. That doesn't make sense in that way. So at least not from that company's perspective. It does make sense from Gygax because he wants to associate himself with other names that people know and can relate to. But Avalon Hill didn't necessarily want that association, at least at first, and especially when it went into like the Satanic Panic era and all that type of stuff. But let me go ahead and talk more about how Outdoor Survival wasn't even the best system. It might have been the best in its space in doing the board game of what it was doing. I don't think there was any even real competition. It kind of made its own thing. But it missed the heroic aspect of original Dungeons and Dragons. It missed how it missed when it treats everyone the same, as if they're the same hit dice. Like there's no difference between a 14th level magic user and a first level halfling thief, or a halfling. I even have to be a thief. And believe it or not, the first level halfling might be better at outdoor survival than the 14th level magic user, because there's no accounting for magic. So can the magic user use spells to get out of these situations that just say death? Can we get around these things? Is there ways to survive this? And you really don't have rules for like wandering encounters that really merge perfectly across those two things because they weren't designed for each other. I think if they would have spent some time and come up with their own system, something that scaled a little bit or that you could choose to put points into, not like a full skill system, but sort of like a choose your own adventure or what you want to be better at. Do you want to be better at repairing your gear or survival, or is there a class maybe that does this better? Kind of like how different classes in future editions have different amounts of skill points, and the thief can do more things. Now, I think those systems miss too. I'm not going to get into that, but I feel like there was a framework that could have been done, and just using the framework that Outdoor Survival gave you, without the ranks, the tiers, the levels, the showing growth as the character progressed, I think is where a mistake was made and where they went wrong. Also, it doesn't take into any sort of condition of like constitution, whether you have high or low. If you're trying to march 25 miles and you have a 3 con, good luck. There's nothing in con for that. There's nothing in outdoor survival for that. It's up to the referee. And again, they don't really make the suggestion on that either. And I think this is a place they probably could have done that. So we're going to go into the combat system here. Number 5. And I'm going to put like a 5B on this. And we're also going to have additional point at the end. So the combat system, at least this time they're the owner of the game, Chainmail. They sent you to a different game for the primary rules of the game system, the main combat rules. And when you get there, They don't send you to a specific page. Now, mind you, this book for the third edition was wrote in 1971. The game came out in 1974. This is a thing they could have done. If you're talking to literary people who you believe read a lot of books and are big into history, if you go to Chainmail on page whatever, on this paragraph, you can find this thing here, and this is what we're talking about. That's a thing that they could have done, but they didn't do that. The problem you run into is they sent you over there to a new game to be able to do combat, a main thing in the game. You have to do combat to be able to really level and advance. I mean, there's ways you can do outside of that, but the reality is you're going to end up in combat. It's a bit of force to do that and to not really have anything in the main rules applied. They do have an alternative combat system, which is a problem because the founders thought it was a less sophisticated system and was more of a basic thing. And then all of the monsters had the stat blocks for that alternative system and not the man-to-man in fantasy or mass combat, which they should have. And that was a big oversight. So I feel like they could have got away with a dual system, having the alternative combat system just being called the attack matrix, an intro level designed attack system that could be used by anyone, but was more designed for the new player or for younger players that were looking for more of a beer and nuts, hack and slash, murder hobo type of game. Now, if you're looking for something a little bit more sophisticated with maybe more nuance to it and extra abilities, something that required a higher level of understanding maybe of combat and how the mechanics of the combat work, man-to-man's your person. Now, I say dual, but that's because I really always feel that fantasy should be included, just like mass combat should be included. Fantasy should have made its way over to the core rule books, though, for original Dungeons & Dragons, because then it would give you an idea of how mass combat works over there, and how man-to-man works. And since man-to-man and fantasy are so similar, I think it would be better. Now, you would have to get more into the weeds, like was the weapon speed of a claw, was a weapon speed of a dragon's claw versus maybe, I don't know, the fists of an Etten or the bite of an Ettercap. I don't know. You'd have to figure that out and probably have to do a whole lot of play testing. But that is where you could have had this more sophisticated type of game that maybe when you originally released it, you put it in there and you have kind of generalizations. And then as you progress the game, you add more and more. You add a complexity to the monsters. The monsters can't parry. The monsters can't do this unless they have primary weapons. Then they can do that. However, maybe you run into a thing and we'll just say supplement X. And this supplement X would be like, maybe monster combat maneuvers or something like that. And you would have, monsters with the ability to parry and the ability to maybe hold their attacks or do feints and this type of stuff. And then you could have introduced feinting into the game and this type of thing in a more rounded way, allowing people to choose what they want, but keep it in the favor of the party, the players, because there's so many things out there trying to kill them. I don't feel like you want to side on the side of the monsters more than the fact that combat is already so brutal and tough as it is. Anyways, that's just my general thoughts on that. I also feel like having these two different systems, a war game system and a new system with this D20, I think that the true grognards would feel like that was a better system and they would have their ability to gravitate to that. And yet on the same table, you'd able to have some new person or someone who didn't play war games able to understand and jump into that specifically. Now I'm going to talk about the last one here, this bonus. And I'm going to kind of go into a thing as really this is point number 6. I'm not going to go into it too far. I'm just going to step into it. And then I'm going to go into my bonus. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because I say we may be able to do another one of these if you guys post in the comments down below different things they got wrong that would be enough to fill a new video, or things they get right and there's enough to make a new video. But here's one bonus thing that they probably could have done better and they kind of got wrong, and that is level drain. The problem with level drain is it's so easy for it to happen. There's no save versus it, and it's an entire level. That's a very difficult thing because, if you're a halfling, you're capped at 4th level. So why do halflings even exist? It's because it was so hard to get levels, most people didn't get it. To just lose it or multiples, never mind the consequences of dropping to 0. I think that's a very tall thing to have on a relatively common creature like a wight or vampires, or, the list goes on. There's wraiths, ghosts, this type of stuff. There are some things I like, and I feel like having it have some level of permanency is good. But again, I'll save that for the next one if we have an additional video. All right, so let me get to the bonus thing. I feel like they went wrong when they didn't seek legal advice and really follow it earlier. Literally, there is copyrighted artwork that was used that they got hammered for in many ways. Still, every time you hear people talking about original Dungeons & Dragons, it's like one of the big things everyone talks about. The Tolkien people were very upset. I would like to say estate, but I don't even really think it was an estate. It was more like a guy who was a producer wanting to make a film, who had the authority and rights to the Tolkien stuff, was trying to essentially not let TSR and Gygax, who he may or may not have known, use that content. And he fought him over like whether Balrogs have wings, whether he can use the name Balrog, which was just simplified by demons and devils. I think that hobbits went to halflings, and that was pretty understandable. Treants went to basically treants. And then there was a lot of other things they went after him for. And then later, with stuff that they didn't quite have the legal team up to speed on, they got hammered pretty hard with what they thought was usable material. So H.P. Lovecraft had a lot of people using this stuff. He didn't want a whole system built around his world, but people that did books or whatever were allowed to use his stuff, and as long as they kind of like made it their own. Look at Conan the Barbarian. A lot of tie-overs and crossovers between the two. A lot of sword and sorcery stuff. A lot of this stuff on Strange Tales, the pulp fiction that was out at the time. But to make an actual product, an actual full-on game, and then to use the full pantheon of Cthulhu was probably a step too far. Same thing with a lot of the stuff, much I think to the surprise of people, was like the Norse pantheon. Odin and Loki and some of these things literally had copyrighted names and everything. Whether they should have or should not have, they did, and it caused them a lot of problems. I think so did the Egyptian one too. So when they went out and made future versions of the demigods and all that book that came out later after first edition, when they reprinted it in first edition, they had to end up going back. Well, all these problems started here. They wouldn't have had to remake it. They wouldn't have that black eye. They wouldn't have these problems if they would have shored up the problems of having a better legal team or seeking legal advice. The whole joke was that TSR sued everyone, and they were the ones breaking the rules so often. And I think they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar a couple times. Again, this is a topic I'm going to talk about more in other videos because I feel like it's worth talking about specifically in those. But I just wanted to bring it up here because we're talking about things they got wrong and what they could have done different. Now, I talked about in the beginning of the video about the fact that They couldn't really do this thing because they were making it by a gnat's hair. Well, sometimes when you hire a legal team or you take legal advice, whatever that means to that size of company at the time, you actually end up becoming more efficient. Um, Even if it hadn't been a full on thing, but they probably could have found a way to do it for better. 1974 was a big year for a lot of people, and if they could have prevented what happened in 77 and 80 something and whatever it was, and all that period of time, and then later with Dave Arneson and his exit, and Gygax and his exit, I feel like they could have been a lot more of a structured company, and seeds that were laid here ended up being the reason why a certain Williams was in a position to remove people from the payroll. And I feel like mistakes were made, and if they would have had the legal advice, some of the biggest, Monday morning quarterbacking, the looking back, being hindsight, being 2020, could have been avoided. And I think what that really says is for us who are moving forward, getting that just a little bit to make sure you're protected. You never know what you're preventing. Anyways, guys, I've gone on long enough. Hope you guys like this video. If you have, let me know in the comments down below. And if this is a type of video that you would get more from, please subscribe. But simply give me a like, helps a lot too. I'm getting really close to getting to 500 subscriptions. And that's a huge milestone that I've been working on over 6 years now. And I could have made it a lot sooner, making different types of videos, but I make videos that I enjoy and that I like. And that's why I'm talking about original Dungeons and Dragons, when I could be talking about many other things. That would be a larger amount of subscriptions, and I probably would be monetized and all that type of stuff. However, I'm doing what I love and what I find passion in, and otherwise I wouldn't be doing it with as much detail as I've been doing it. I'm still in a great place, guys. Don't think I'm in a bad spot or got any sort of undue pressure. I am going to try and increase a little bit of what I'm doing with some different formats, so you'll see some changes. Also, I put a post out on the 1st of March talking about the fact that I'm going to go a different direction. I want to be clear, that is not my next move. That is going to be probably farther along. My next move is going to be into Homes Edition briefly for a few videos. There's not a lot to talk about in there when I leave original Dungeons & Dragons, and then I'm going to jump into BX for a while, and then I'll do a little bit about Bigme, probably like a Homes Edition, unless there's a huge amount of request, desire, passion that we run into. And then I'll be going into whatever this poll says to go into for the most part, or at least it's going to heavily weigh which way I'm going. So if you haven't seen that poll, go check it out. Just came out in the 1st. Look in my community tab, go in there, give me what you think. Let me know down in the comments down below if there's anything specific you're wanting to know, and we'll go from there. Okay, guys, hope you guys enjoyed it. Keep rolling those dice, and see you in the next video. Bye.